Duncan, let's come to you in Glasgow. So you are clearly somebody who's both on both sides of the divide. You're looking at quite high level conceptual policy, but also you're trying to run a city. You're trying to keep a city running. Can I ask you a question? We talk about smart cities. There's this idea of the smart city. In my experience, most cities are pretty damn stupid. I mean, in terms of smartness, in that, if you consider that a city is a place you get up in the morning, you have your breakfast, you go to a city, then you work, and in the evening you go home. And you might do, but Friday afternoon, when you're trying to go home, there's no city in the world that actually works, does it? I mean, they're pretty well over there. So are cities themselves, as a concept, almost reaching the limit of what they can do because they've just outgrown everything pretty much?
That's a fascinating question. Thank you, David. I mean, as you know, the world is essentially an urban planet now.
I'm just going to tell you, I've been working with politicians. So what I'm expecting you now to say, Duncan, is that's a fascinating question, and they completely ignore it because that's what politicians. That's what politicians say before they're about to do a complete and utter swerve around it. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a famous politician here in Glasgow who gave a reply to a heckler. Please, will you not take yes for an answer? So I'll go for that one. I mean, there's a really interesting set of issues here in Glasgow and many other cities around. I think agency for people and for the institutions that work with them, and the sense in which around issues like climate change that seems very hard to grasp. And there's a set of issues as well around institutional culture. And you gave the example earlier, David, of 3 Mile Island. If we add Chernobyl to that, essentially those were cultures of hiding the truth, of trying to avoid responsibility, and of a culture of fear for being blamed for things. And so actually I return to something I said in my earlier remarks about openness being really significant for cities. I'm going to make the case for cities. Constantina's on the call, so I'm going to go back to the earliest Greek city-states. The fundamental question they asked themselves was, how should we live? How should we live together? And we've continued to interrogate ourselves over the centuries since about how people can get on in cities. But one of the key assets that we have, and I think goes to the heart of your question, David, these are the places where you get people together. And you have universities and businesses and public institutions, and you have the street level interaction. I'm gonna riff on Jane Jacobs here. Cities are organic places where if we are paradoxically both the locus of most of the world's problems and the only places where the sustainable solutions will occur. And that's something to make you pleased and proud. And I'm a great supporter of urban living. Nature's wonderful and we need to protect and nurture it. But cities are the products of human civilization at their peak, in my view, and can continue to be great places for people. Having said that, cities are, as we also know, incredibly unequal. And the issue about the right to the city, a right to the public commons, the right to be able to speak openly is contested wherever we go. But the other thing, of course, about cities is they are precisely the places where that contest takes place, and therefore where a robust, at times street-level democracy is being built. And when I go back to the issue of climate change, one of the interesting things, this kind of follows Ian's point, is that increasingly the literature about climate change is less about the science of what is going on with atmospheric physics and the technology of reducing or mitigating emissions. It is about social psychology. It is about institutions and people and how on an average day you would make sure, take great care in crossing a crowded road, but apparently have no particular concern over what's coming just down the street from climate change. And I don't have answers to that except to say the issue of agency is really important, and how you bring at people a sense that they can have a locus of control in their lives and over the decisions that matter to them. And that leads me into another thought, David, especially about cities, which is I do a lot of work with my colleagues in public health. Now in Scotland, public health is the beginning of statistical science, because there are parish records going back many centuries, which are very accurate on deaths, births, and causes of death. And so actually, public health gives us something, going back to what Karina said, that the metrics of the warning system. But public health also talks about the overall patterns that we need to recognize in what's going on there, particularly what colleagues in public health will call the social determinants around housing, economy, education, and so forth. And I think when you bring those together in that kind of conversation, which I think cities are best at brokering and fostering, then you get some of the solutions emerging, I think, because you have the best of data science and you have the best of the people desperately trying to work out what it all means and where we should go with it. And therefore, I go back to that sense of a city as an ecosystem for an engaged conversation about living together, about working together, and about becoming more resilient. And I actually think we still, as cities, have a lot to be said for where we're going there, David. But going to your issue about paradigm as well, we need to include the strong possibility that actually there are changes and reinforcing feedbacks in those changes over which none of us have any control, and few of us maybe would be able to predict the outcomes. And when you look at particularly at things like AI and so forth, that becomes more profoundly so. Having said that, when you look at an issue like robotics, automation, and AI, and how will it affect the labour market and the economy, some of the solutions are just old-fashioned ones that we've known for a while, such as a universal basic income. And so actually, my point, which I know we made in our conversation yesterday, David, is that many of the issues we're struggling with would have been well understood by our great-grandparents because they are issues of power, control, and democracy. And we should not allow the complexity and the difficulty and the suddenness of these things to take away from the fact that these are understandable issues, but like any of them across the many centuries, they're not always ones that we get to choose easily, and that therefore becomes an issue once more of democracy. And for us here in Glasgow, therefore, proving to people that material improvement is occurring in their lived experience because the street's not flooding anymore, the vacant and derelict land has been greened or is a community growing space, is vital. You need to give people a sense of hope at that level, along with the big policy issues about reducing emissions and so forth, much of which seems to be out of people's control and looks like they're the big high-level decisions. And we just need to take care, I think, that resilience agenda has meaning and traction in the lives of our communities, because if we forget that, then we're forever in the world of the PowerPoint presentation and no one's happy.
It's interesting you mentioned the Greek city because and democracy, because we have this vision. You mentioned the Greek city. I see Athenian pillars and people in togas walking around. Of course, to the people at the time, the city was a center of degradation, decadence, corruption, lack of planning, unmanaged traffic, kids who had no respect for their elders. So at that, I think thus has it been across the centuries. So of course we do have the city has always been has moved forward technology and art and finance and culture, and at the same time has had its feet in his feet of clay in the mud, and has always been seen as that. You mentioned the culture and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. I was quite involved. Well, I wrote a report about Fukushima. So I speak Japanese. I spent 5 years in Japan when I was younger. I speak, read, and write fluent Japanese. I was in Japan a couple of weeks ago, and I met Kiyoshi Kurokawa, who wrote the official report into Fukushima that I've just put a reference to, a link to. But he says in his forward executive summary, which I highly recommend people read, the failure in Fukushima was man-made disaster. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a man-made disaster. It was people doing bad things, just like there was, for example, in Grenfell Tower, or there was in the Boeing 737 MAX, or there is in anything else you want to think about. It is people doing bad things, even though then they know they're bad things. And I think we need to have a look at some of the systemic issues about what we're talking about. Karina, you have your hand up. I'm going to ask you to be quite brief because I do want to bring Konstantina again. So Karina, let's bring you in, and then we'll come back to Konstantina.
Yeah, just a really quick point that there's been a very large movement recently, over many decades, headed up by one of my colleagues, Professor Ilan Kelman, that is like no natural disasters. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. We have natural hazards, but the disaster is generated by human activity
Yes.
Whatever that may be. Either we've built a city somewhere dangerous or we've not responded to it. So it's really that idea that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, and we have to stop saying that, because actually we have the accountability and responsibility, and it's on us to make sure that we plan accordingly for that.
The event, in our perspective, the event is an event. The disaster is a failure to be ready. Hurricane Katrina was not a disaster. Hurricane Katrina was an event. It was a failure of New Orleans and the federal agencies to be ready. That was the disaster. So, Ilan Kelman, we're absolutely in agreement with you. That's why I think that is a brilliant and insightful analysis. And of course, in academic terms, a brilliant and insightful analysis means it agrees with everything I think. So, as opposed to an interesting concept, which is on the other side of the forum. Let's come bring you Konstantina. Plenty to discuss.
Yes.
Any thoughts on so far? You said you were going to bring us some examples. It'd be lovely to know some examples of where things do work. We do tend to focus on things that don't work. It'd be lovely to have a look at things that do work.
Well, actually, my examples, yes, okay, I'll use examples of things that work and don't work. A small comment on this theoretical conversation, which is not, I think it's actually fascinating how we keep going back into this distinction between event and disaster. I think it really speaks to what we have been talking about: democracy, management of resources, and where does this paradigm shift takes us. I think this is related. And again, so going back into the cities, these are the examples I wanted to use. I have had the privilege to be working with different cities, mainly in Europe and the Middle East, but also exposed to work in the United States, in Africa. We're also working with regions at the moment. And that's also very interesting, because I'm working with 13 regions, which are located in different parts of the world in the Mediterranean zones. So they face the same kind of climate risks. I'm sorry about the noise. I will choose, I promise I'll choose next time. This is normally a very quiet spot where I am, so I apologize. Okay, back to my point. So those 13 regions, they are located in the so-called kind of Mediterranean climate zones in the north and the south hemispheres, and they, at the moment, kind of working together because they through three main risks, which they have identified as kind of common, and they're common to all of us. You will not be surprised: drought, heat, and wildfires. So they think that this is, and they try to see these three risks in a holistic way. So from governance, from policy, I feel very bad. Apparently, we scored. Okay, from governance, from policy perspective, from developing common projects. So what we're trying to do with them, this is called the Mediterranean Climate Action Partnership, is to see what are the similar regulations that they can adopt at the same time. And, you know, whether they can go to global policy fora and say, okay, this is what we need as those most vulnerable regions. The reason they prefer they're the most vulnerable and the cities is because, according to data, the biggest changes, the biggest climatic changes are much bigger and much faster in those Mediterranean climates. So the three, let's say, degrees medium up, like temperature rise, will actually be more in some parts of the world. The drought is expected to be at 80% in countries like Greece by 2050. So that's why they're kind of connecting together. However, and I want to use the CRF, the City Resilience Framework that ARP developed, Mike mentioned here. And we used to use in an official way, and RCN is still using. This is an excellent framework that many cities have used. Glasgow included, Manchester, and other cities which have adopted the so-called Chief Resilient Officer position, as Duncan is. Sometimes is also a Director of Resilience, sometimes is a Deputy Mayor for Resilience. This is a really interesting change that cities adopted and continue to adopt today around the world, to say that I need to have a position that's horizontal and that addresses and integrates within official urban planning processes. Official urban planning processes, the resilience questions. But what is my negative example is that I find that in mid-sized cities in particular, we're talking about cities, but cities are not the same. They don't have the same resources. And the problem with governments and how we're set up, to your earlier points, is that we see them in a one-size-fits-all way. So countries at the moment, they still negotiate in a way, they still make regulations in a way that deals in a one way, one size fits all, the cities, all risks. And while resilience planning and the chief resilience officer says, okay, let's identify our common risks and find unique ways, unique solutions that apply to our city, to our context, to our region. And I am afraid that cities, mid-sized cities in particular, they are not integrating. While there are the frameworks, let's say in the EU, in the UK as well, cities are required to have annual plans, 5-year plans as well. They do not match this to this risk management. Anything that has to do with resilience tools and mechanisms, it's not institutionalized. It's an add-on. The CRF is an add-on. The UNDRR tools are add-on. The resilience strategies are add-on. And I would say that if I want to make a recommendation, it would be interesting I would like to work with many here and whoever is interested to see how we can translate those tools into mainstreaming them into the practices of urban design, so that we don't have this language of, oh, this is really interesting, but let's see reality. And this is the example I want to mention. I see it every day. And one particular example, which is live at the moment and speaks to maybe even interest, design, money, you will tell me. I'm working with a city in Greece. It's a mid-sized city in transition, actually, similarly, let's say, to as Glasgow was. This is Kozani. It's the powerhouse, was the powerhouse of like coal-burning powerhouse of Greece. So that area was like really producing the energy and electricity for Greece based on coal. At the moment, the factories are closing based on regulation, and this hot potato is on the new administration. They are being pushed fundamentally by the national government to adopt a natural gas solution for the district heating and for their energy needs. It's a big investment, while at the same time, in the European Union, we have a regulation that says that by 2030, we will not be allowed to be using natural gas in any new constructions. And also, Kozani is one of the 100 EU cities in transition. So meant to actually showcase how they will be net zero by 2030. So on the one hand, you have this like theory, right? And a new elected authority that they say, we don't want to be connected, we want to have new like natural resources, renewables, innovative technology. They told me, oh yeah, this is interesting. But they say, oh, but our everyday life, this juxtaposition, say, okay, we want to work with stakeholders. We want to plan in a different way. Risk management is a very interesting approach. So they're in a learning process, and this is an excellent example for us to be working with them. But at the same time, they're actively being pushed, and the mayor is invited into meetings at the national level where the government's telling them, too little, too late. Oh, so sorry that this hot potato came to you. There is no money for your investment. Let's have this let's have this transitional solution, because natural gas is actually accepted by the EU as a transitional phasing, out. And we are working with them and trying to connect to them. To me, this is also resilience planning and having a global community. We're trying to give them the tools and mechanisms as a urban authority, as a sub-national level. You can be connected with different mechanisms, with different stakeholders around Europe, around the world. We want to help you present a different solution. And this is, I think, a very live, a very real example of what is resilience building, because they're not going to be resilient if now there's a massive investment in natural gas. They're going to be locked in for the next 20 years, right? So even though they will say then, yes, I will adopt other, tools and mechanisms, I will start planning. This is in my opinion, an example that showcases the complexity and the potential for success or failure.